Valerie's going to try to get her presentation loaded. All right, I'm Natalie Petch, and I'm the chair of the CCAC, and we usually go around and say our name, including all the citizens present and what neighborhood we live in, just so we know who's represented. So I'm Allie Petch, and I live near Mid Springs.
I'm Sean Bird, CCAC, and live off of St. George.
Tom Lotion from John Cat. 24 Highlands.
Brian Day, Emerald Ridge.
Mike Kunkel, Quarry Farm.
Jenny Moore, Village Avenue.
David Mitchell, Fair Hill.
Doug Bates, Whitehall Road.
John McKean, Batesville.
Costa Summers, 250.
I'll go with that.
Bill Yoder, Wickham Pond.
Patrick May with Yancey Lumber. Donnie Rose on the Yancey Lumber.
Alice Marble with the Daily Progress. Lily and Mazay, I live in Old Shore.
Andrew Newcomb, neighborhood planner in Albemarle County.
Bill Fritz, I'm with Albemarle County Community Development.
Ken Thacker, St. George Avenue.
Marsh Patty, Old Trail.
Rashmi Guy, Westlake. Next row.
Dennis Hobart, Yancey Mills.
Judy Hobart, Yancey Mills, Hillsborough Lane. Mary Ruth, Hillsborough Lane.
Debbie Messler, Little, Hillsborough Lane.
Roger Baber, Arbor Life Tree Care.
On the left, Whitehall. Yeah, Yancey Mills.
Joseph Jones, downtown Whitehall.
Whitehall. Singles Lane.
Lisa Swales, Yancey Mills.
Davey Swiles, Yancey Mills.
Carrie Henson, Midway Road off Miller School.
Paul Grady, Nathan's River.
Isabel Jordan, Yancey Mills. Yancey Mills. Sherry Johnson, Park Road.
Matt Hildebrand, Park Road.
Rob Langdon, Shelton Mill Road.
Okay. Back here.
Bill Maypole, Ground Road.
Mike Marshall, Crozet Gazette, and I live in Mid Springs.
Lisa Martin, Crozet Gazette.
All right, thanks everybody. I saw that Mike sent some minutes a little while ago. I actually didn't get to look at them, but maybe someone did. Yeah, all right.
I move adoption.
Okay. All right, all in favor of approves the minutes, say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Okay, so we've got the minutes. I don't think that Valerie's ready yet, so maybe we should start with, well, I don't know, we could either talk about CFP thing, or we could go with Andrew.
Why don't we Andrew to show the template? Or is that?
Do you need a minute, Valerie?
Probably, yes.
Okay. You wanna go, or do you wanna?
Yeah, I can make it work for just a
Do
second.
you need the
Or you
projector
need-
too?
I can do it live. We don't need projector. I can-
I can do
Let's
it.
just,
Yeah, I'll
we'll
do
just,
it.
you want us to chat?
Okay, yeah, sounds good. So, last we left, the thing we were talking about here was the Crozet Elementary expansion and its priority and its position in the capital improvement plan that's going forward right now. So we were last time in the midst of capital improvement planning advisory committee that was trying to finalize which projects it would recommend to the board of supervisors to get funded. The Crozet Elementary expansion was in that group, but it was a little bit tentative possibly. My understanding, because I wasn't at the last, I was at the first advisory committee meeting, I wasn't at the last two, but my understanding from the reporting that came out of it is ultimately what ended up happening was the advisory committee, there's approximately $55-ish million that are available, up to $55 million that the Board of Supervisors has sort of indicated that they're willing to possibly raise taxes to cover over the next 5-year cycle. And the advisory committee selected 4 projects from the capital improvement plan that it's going to recommend the Board of Supervisors to go in there. That is transportation leveraging funding, economic development, Crozet Elementary, Kale Elementary expansions. 4 projects. according to the projections, totaled just under $55 million. So the good news is that going forward, the Crozet elementary expansion is on track currently to get funded. If that project gets funded, the expansion would be open in time for the 22-23 school year, 3 years from now, 3.5 years from now. But we just have to make sure, because my understanding, and Ann just walked in, so maybe Ann can speak to this better. You know, the advisory committee's recommendation is that we pursue these 4 projects for capital improvement that will cost approximately $55 million. And that's contingent on the Board of Supervisors following through with a corresponding tax increase that actually funds that full $55 million. If that tax increase, they don't have to fund up to that. But if they don't fund up to that, then that Crozet elementary expansion could be on the chopping block. And so I think at this point, in terms of our group and the community going forward, we've done what we need to do in terms of encouraging the advisory committee to pass that along and saying this Crozet elementary expansion is a critical project that should be funded. But between now and April, I think, is the final budgeting process. It's just incumbent on us to stay on the Board of Supervisors to make sure they actually follow through with that rate increase. I know there's been some hesitancy in the past to raise, at least there were some comments in the spring about raising taxes by enough to cover that $55 million project price tag. So I think that's where we are now. It's just making sure that we're staying on top of the board, that they follow through with that increase.
Joe, do you have any idea how much of an increase, or maybe I should, Ann, do you have any idea how much of an increase is required to do the 55?
The proposal would be a penny per year.
Okay.
And that keeps it level as opposed to higher, lower, which made everybody crazy. But this would be a much rate amount, and that would allow the 4 big projects to be fully funded.
A penny per year, I don't get that one.
So a penny on the tax rate increase
Okay.
per year.
So are you in favor of that?
I can live with that, yes, because the things are essential. I mean, I have had lots of discussions about this with people, but similarly to in 2016 and also 5 years earlier than that, people said to the kids, people are here. We have to meet these obligations for people who are here and do it as carefully planning it out so it's not an abrupt thing. I think that a large increase all at once, which certainly was recommended by some people, would be completely impossible for many taxpayers to handle.
How many years?
So that we're planning on a 5-year horizon for that.
So did you get any sense where of those 4 projects the Crozet school is as far as priority?
Well, I mean...
Well, the 4 are budgeted
Just
together.
okay.
They're different. I mean, Crozet was the highest priority of the school department
Okay.
because of it being able to solve the problem with Brownsville. And I should say also that 1 cent is an equivalent, so if there's wonderful success, economic development, and there are other sources that take care of this, then it would not necessarily be a tax rate increase. So if we're successful with economic development and there's a lot of other revenue that comes in, that would be ideal,
Right.
best case scenario.
One of the things I think we should look at, we didn't have it in the last master plan, but in this master plan, in the principles, we should include something about funding education or education support in general. I think it's a valuable principle that, that our schools be well funded and well done.
Well, that would enable us to opine on whether or not we support a tax increase too, as part of the master plan, right?
Well, I wouldn't add a tax increase, but I would add a principle that the community does, support education as a basic value, and for that, the schools must be, must be funded, or we can put, because we've had the same problem. It's not the fact that this is the first time we've had the learning cottages or trailers, whatever you want to call them. This is, it's been an ongoing problem, and I don't think it's going to get any better. And we still have, a significant amount of growth yet to come. And we add the new apartments, and then you look at the Pleasant Green, how many houses in there? 200 some plus. So, this is going to be this is not something that's going to to solve. If
Yeah, I
there's
think-
something we should.
I agree with Doug, though, that if there's more about education in the master plan, the CAC
Yes.
has more leverage, just because that's our.
That's a good point. Good
So if in fact your suggestion is taken up, we should be doing it now because, Andrew, aren't we going to the master planning now?
Right, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I agree. The more there is about education in the master plan, the more the CAC
Right.
can work on education, since that's priority. Okay, are you ready, Valerie? I am. Let's go.
Good evening, I'm Valerie Long. I know a lot of you, not all of you though. First, thank you for your patience while we got the technology sorted out. Thank you again, both on the county for his technological assistance. As you saw on the agenda, this is about the Yancey lumber mill and a group of what we call special exception proposals that will come before the Board of Supervisors at some point in the next month or two, maybe. But we wanted to, particularly at Ann's request, bring this tonight and just explain to the community what the proposals involve and why we're here, and provide an opportunity for y'all to ask us questions and for us to answer. And I also want to introduce a number of representatives from the lumber company who are here tonight. I'll start with, I see Sarah Yancey May, who's here, one of the representatives of the family and ownership. We have Donnie Rose, who's the president of the company. We have Patrick May, who's vice president. We also have from our one of our consultants, Bill Yoder, who is with Ascend Tech. He is our noise or acoustical consultant, has been helping us a lot over the last year or so. Did I miss anyone? That's it? Yes.
Something else, could you just clarify, is this like public meeting for an action, or is this just kind of putting out feelers for something that's coming down the pipe later on?
Sure. It's coming down the pipe. It will eventually be before the Board of Supervisors for a vote. It's not a special use permit or a rezoning application. It's what the county calls a special exception, or it's a group of special exception requests. Think of it as a request for a modification or a waiver from county regulations. They just call it a special exception request. It's just sort of the application term. So it will come before, and we just wanted to have a community meeting so that everybody was aware of what the proposal is, because otherwise it'd be confusing. So I have obviously on the slides the company owns two parcels. I'm sure you're all familiar with the location on Route 250 right by the interstate. The company was founded back in the late 40s. It's currently under third generation ownership and development, which is fairly unique, I think, in this day and age. But the mill was established long before there was a zoning ordinance in the county. And it has evolved over many decades as the company has grown, as technology has changed, and they've adapted over time. I know it's probably hard to see, but we have an aerial map here that labels all of the various structures on the property. It's largely the sawmill, there's a planer building, there's a number of sheds, and there's a lot of areas of stacked wood piles or stacked lumber that's being processed. This is an image that Sarah May provided to me that is of the mill from, I think, the early 1950s. It's almost, I'm not sure if I don't have a pointer, but you can see in the bottom right corner is Route 250. And orientation, this is roughly where the current office building is now up against. You can see there's no interstate in the background too. Things have changed quite a bit. There's an apple packing plant that was there in the middle because it used to be part of an apple orchard. But anyway, that's just to provide a little bit of historical context in terms of how the mill has evolved over the many years. The reason the issue came up because the company is getting ready to make a significant investment in equipment at their property. And I've sort of drawn the red circle around the piece of equipment. It's called a sorter stacker. And it's a technological improvement that will help improve the efficiencies in the sorting of the lumber and the stacking of the lumber. And I will let the folks from the company elaborate as necessary on that process, but generally the lumber comes out of the sawmill in a variety of different sizes, 2x4s, 4x8s, etc. And they all come out, and this machine will help mechanize that process, make it safer and more efficient. It's the way the industry is going, and it's a necessary investment for the company to continue to remain competitive in their industry. It's a large piece of equipment. It's partially under construction. They started building it. We realized there were some challenges on some setback issues, so they have stopped construction. It's been stopped for over a year, actually, while we've worked through some of these issues. We started talking with Ann and folks at the county staff about this over a year ago, and we're getting ready to bring this proposal out to the community when we ran into the issue, the so-called hum noise that created such a disruption for about the past 9 months to a year. And so I'll go ahead and talk about that. Some of you all may know about it or know the history of it from the media coverage and other things. But as part of routine maintenance, they replaced a fan in the boiler that is part of the kiln, which dries the lumber. The same fan they've used previously, it was just a new, updated one, or just a fresh one. For reasons we still can't figure out, it created this tonal noise, this hum that caused such a disruption. Originally, when people speculated that it was the lumber yard, we were all sure, no, it can't be ours. We haven't done anything different. The company said, we haven't done anything different. We replaced one piece of equipment with the exact same piece of equipment. It can't be us. But then when other things weren't ruled out, finally the company said, well, let's hire a noise consultant and let's make sure, or let's prove that it's not us, because everyone thinks it is us. So that's when we got Bill involved. And he's, again, an acoustical consultant, and he came out and did some testing, and he said, guess what? It is you guys. So then we quickly worked with Bill on some solutions, and basically it took 9 months to a year to find a solution that was effective. We started with some custom designed silencers or mufflers. Had to be shipped from Canada. It was very expensive. We put a rush order on it. It arrived. Installed it, and it was almost completely ineffective. So then they worked with a different company, went through that process again, almost the exact same outcome. It had very minimal impact or benefit. In the meantime, they had, in order to reduce the impact on the community, they reduced the power level on the boiler at night and on the weekends down to what we called pilot light mode. They couldn't turn the boiler off completely at night, because then when they turned it back on in the morning, that rapid change in temperature would have damaged the boiler. So they kept it at pilot light mode to reduce the noise at night to stop disrupting folks, and then they turned it back up during the day. And they kept in that pilot mode for just about the entire time until they found a solution. That was a big challenge because it meant that they couldn't dry the lumber in the same pace and time frame as they had been. So it was an impact to their business, but they knew that was the right thing to do in order to avoid continuing to disrupt folks in the evenings and during the daytime. Eventually, they ended up buying a new fan, which required some upgrades to their facility. They had to increase the height of their stack, and they had to expand the base of their fan to accommodate this larger fan. That still did not work as well either. Finally, with Bill's help, they found a consultant, I think in Europe, who had this technology that everyone was very skeptical of, that essentially is an insert in the fan that helps reduce the tonal noise. And that was put in place in April or May, is that right? Roughly. And they tested it for a few months to make sure it would actually work before they fully ramped back up. We did some more testing and confirmed that it was reducing the tonal noise. So that's the short story. After we finish this, we are happy to answer as many questions as you all may have. I'll probably ask Bill to help with any technical questions about the noise issues because he's obviously the expert. But I wanted to go ahead and explain that. As a result of that delay, we wanted to fix that problem first before we came back to the community and to the Board of Supervisors and asked for any relief from any of the setback regulations. So now that we've solved the noise, at least the hum problem, that's where we are now. So the sorter stacker is roughly halfway constructed. In order to continue progress on the construction and installation, we realized that it didn't meet the setback regulations. And even though the mill itself, the existing equipment, Most of it is exempt from a lot of the setback regulations and the noise regulations and lots of other regulations that were implemented and adopted after the mill began operations in the late 40s. But obviously, any new equipment has to comply with those regulations. And so in the process of reviewing that, we discovered that it didn't meet setback regulations. And then in working with staff, we realized there's a lot of other pieces of equipment and other regulations that apply to the property that, again, were added after the mill started that we don't comply with as a result because they came later. And so at the zoning administrator's suggestion and direction, and it's a different zoning administrator now, but she had said, while you're asking for relief from the setback regulations for the new equipment, why don't you go ahead and ask for modifications to any other regulations that you don't comply with, and we'll address those all at one time in a comprehensive fashion so that your project can be in compliance with all the current regulations. So when we started putting together a list, it was a relatively long list of regulations that have been adopted over the years that the mill has not ever complied with because it started first and evolved. So I'll go through a list, but I wanted to explain that part first. You'll see the list on the next page. I know you won't be able to read it, and I'm going to go through each one at a time. The first one involves the setback along the front of the property. First thing I'll tell you is, and let me go back actually one slide, maybe to the very beginning. There's one piece of equipment that you may have noticed as you drive down Route 250. It's the piece that's closest to Route 250 near the logs. That is, again, I'll defer to them on the technical terms. It's called the stem loader. They may have other names for it. The cut up sometimes, the debarker. The logs get loaded onto that. It's essentially a conveyor. They get dropped down and then they go in and the bark is stripped off the logs before the lumber heads it into, or the wood heads into the sawmill itself. That piece of equipment encroached over the line of the VDOT right-of-way. And it's not so simple to just move the piece of equipment back. It's attached to the lumber mill, has to be the length that it is. So we started trying to figure out what to do. We met with Joel D'Annunzio and others at VDOT to say, what should we do? They identified the fact that the VDOT right-of-way in that location is quite large and that they have far more right-of-way than they actually needed. So we have been working with VDOT over the last year, and we're about this close to closing on the purchase of 10 feet of the VDOT right-of-way so that that piece of equipment will no longer encroach into the VDOT right-of-way. It'll all be entirely on the Yancey lumber property. We literally have a copy of the signed deed. We've paid them the money for it. We're just waiting for them to actually record the deed. We were hoping it might have happened by today, but it should be literally any time. So we have now, to go back to this slide, this is just to show where the original property line was and where the new property line is, or will be as soon as that deed is recorded. So it's an additional 10 feet. Nevertheless, there is a county regulation that says that there is a 10-foot setback along the front of the property. So all equipment has to be back 10 feet from the property line. Unfortunately, even with the additional 10 feet acquired from VDOT, the stem loader was 5.5 feet over the line already. So we're only about 4 feet back from the line. So one of the first requests we have is to reduce the front setback from 10 feet to 0 feet so that we can comply with that. The second one, my copy in front of me so I can read along a little bit easier. I can't see it at the angle I'm at, and I can't get any closer. There's also a number of setback regulations, some of which apply that are, we call them zoning ordinance specific. The property is zoned heavy industrial, and so for every zoning district in the county, there are certain setback regulations, and they vary for residential uses versus commercial or residential. And there's also separate and additional setback regulations that apply specifically to sawmills and lumber yards. So we have and they're not the same, and they don't cover the same things. So we have gone ahead and asked for relief from both, but I'll walk you through. This slide has to do with setbacks that are specific to property that's zoned heavy industrial. The existing regulation is that structures have to be 100 feet from any residential or rural area zoning district. And on all sides, the property is surrounded by rural area zoned property. And on the opposite side of Route 250, it's residential or village residential. So it essentially applies around the entire property boundaries. And because the property has this irregular shape, it's challenging to fit it all in. So what we've proposed is to reduce that setback from 100 feet to 35 feet. So the area that you see in red is the existing setback line at 100 feet, and the area in the yellow band is the area where the setback would be reduced to 35 feet. And that enables all the structures to actually become in compliance with that. As you can see in particular, the sorter stacker, the yellow line, and I realize it may be hard to see, just skirts the corner of that. So that would fit. The next one has to do with off-street parking setbacks. Right now, the regulation is that parking has to be 30 feet. Any off-street parking has to be 35 feet back from a boundary line that has different zoning. So in this case, it has to be 30 feet back from the adjacent rural area land. And as you all may know, the parking lot, the employee parking lot is right up there in the front, adjacent to Route 250, kind of right in the corner. And so we're proposing to reduce that setback from 30 feet to 0 feet in order to comply with that. The next one has to do with what we call the sawmill-specific setback regulations. There's two of them. The first one applies to structures, buildings, as well as the storage of lumber, logs, chips, and timber. And that one says that you have to have all of those things 100 feet back from any lot line. And as you can you all see those buildings sort of through those lines from here? Okay. As you can see, there's a number of areas where existing structures that have been in place for many years do not comply with that regulation. And so, especially the storage of lumber, logs, chips, and timber. So we're proposing to reduce that setback along Route 250 to 0 feet so that it there's room for the logs and the building there to be where it is. And then in every other area other than the portion right against Route 250, from 100 feet to 35 feet, which will allow those to be in compliance. If there's any areas where it may still require some stacks of lumber to be moved further back from the property line eventually, but that at least provides, that is achievable. The next sawmill-specific setback. So remember, the last one applied to structures and storage of logs and timber and lumber. This setback is really interesting. It applies to not just structures or stacks of wood or timber, but the mechanical equipment. This applies to saws, planers, chippers, conveyors, chutes, and other similar machinery. And it says that you have to have any of those pieces of equipment have to be set back 600 feet from any adjacent residential structure or residence. And so when we looked at this, and you'll see there are some sort of red squares, there's 4 of them that mark where adjacent residences are, and we drew some circles in to show a 600-foot radius. And you can see that that covers a large portion of the sawmill itself. particularly the main sawmill here, also, of course, the sorter stacker, and some of the other equipment buildings here. I don't know if you can see it, but this is essentially where that line is. So really only in this area can you achieve that. What's really interesting too is the way it's written. Someone could go build a house tomorrow on the edge of the property line or 50 feet back, and you might be in compliance today, but you wouldn't be in compliance tomorrow after they built their house. I don't think that was intended, but again, this regulation, all of these setback regulations came into effect in 1980 when the zoning ordinance was adopted. And so the mill had been in operation for many years prior to that. So we've never complied with this, but it also has not been applicable unless a structure was built after that period. So we're proposing to essentially replace this 600-foot radius regulation with a 35-foot setback from the lot line for all of that equipment, which will enable all of that equipment to comply. And then the next one has to do with noise regulations. This is why I wanted to explain the hum issue first. Again, we're pretty confident we've solved the hum issue. The county has a noise ordinance as well, that it sort of always applies, although again, because this business has existed prior to when the noise ordinance was adopted in 1980, for much of the equipment it is not applicable to that equipment. But nonetheless, we want to be able to find out, are we complying with the noise ordinance or are we not? And if we're not, where do we need relief or modification in order to be within the rules? So we hired Bill to do that, and he tested, and you can see the areas where there's a solid circle are areas where the testing revealed it was a little bit above the noise levels. Some of that has to do, particularly the areas along Route 250, because the stem loader, that piece of equipment that now will go right up next to the VDOT right-of-way line, that's a noisy piece of equipment inherently because of the logs that get loaded on. We also have a lot of car traffic going by. Bill can explain better, but it was challenging even to measure the noise during the daytime when that equipment is running, because you have the vehicle traffic along Route 250 as well as along the interstate, and that ambient noise makes it challenging to isolate how much of the noise is actually being generated by this equipment. Nevertheless, in these places, we found that depending on the measurements, and again, Bill can explain, the county ordinance requires it to be measured on an average over a 5-minute period. Little things can throw it off, depending on whether a truck goes by at some point during that 5-minute interval. And we wanted to be on the safe side and just go ahead and ask the county in those areas where it didn't quite meet the regulations. And the ordinance is written to not talk about, you can't, in many places it says you can't make noise louder than certain decibels. The county ordinance is written with regard to what it calls receiving zones. And it says, if you're a heavy industrial user, receiving areas that are zoned residential or rural areas can't hear, you can't produce noise that can be over a certain decibel limit when heard from residential or rural area zone land. So the way we tested it was Bill put his equipment on the edge of the property lines, the so-called receiving areas, and tested, I think with one exception, a few exceptions where it was hard to get to the edge of the property line. But that's why you see the testing mostly taking place in the outside the property line. And there's different rules during the daytime versus the nighttime. It's a 5 decibel more stringent rule or standard at the nighttime. And so the existing regulation, for example, is in the rural and residential receiving zones. In the daytime, you cannot exceed 60 decibels. And at nighttime, you can't exceed 55 decibels. We're proposing to, or we're requesting a modification for that to increase it in the area along adjacent to 250 to 80 because of the noise from the stem loader and the traffic, and then increase it to 74 along all the other boundaries. We have a noise study that we've prepared that we'll be submitting to the county that lists what the measurements were at each of these think it was 17 or 18 measurement points. And we identified where were the highest numbers and then add a little bit of, I think, two decibels of cushion to account for the variation in measurements. I'll let Bill talk about that more when we get to that. So those are the daytime regulations. And then at nighttime, again, the limit currently is 55 decibels. And we're proposing to increase that to 65 along Route 250 only, and then 59 along other boundaries. When we last tested the noise from the kiln fans and hum to make sure we were in compliance with that, depending on what background noise was going on, there were a couple of times where it went up to 56, depending on literally if the frogs were chirping in the woods next to his equipment, or whether I think it was cicadas or something could throw that off, or if a truck went by on the interstate, because it was otherwise quiet, that would throw off the average measurement. So we wanted to have some cushion there to make sure that we were not in violation of that ordinance going forward. We're almost done. There's also a vibration ordinance in the county. And for the most part, the business complies with that, again, except for along Route 250, where because of the stem loader and the activities that go on during the daytime, we're not quite in compliance with the standards of the vibration ordinance. Bill can talk more about exactly how it's measured, what it means. I think he has some ideas about whether it's really the right way to measure vibration or not. It's a challenge, but in any event, right now, there's the existing regulations establish maximum peak velocity for continuous and impulsive vibrations at the adjacent residential zone boundaries. Again, for whatever reason, this one is only measured or applicable to residential zone boundaries, not rural. But because the zoning across the street is village residential, we want to make sure that we've addressed it. And so right now, the existing continuous limit is 0.00 inches per second. Seems pretty high standard. And we're proposing to increase that limit from 0.00 to 0.15 inches per second. And then the limit for impulsive vibration is 0.006 inches per second. And we're proposing to increase that limit to 0.04 inches per second, which is right about where it was measured at along Route 250. And then finally, there are regulations that were also put in place in 1980 that limit the hours of operations of certain types of activities at a lumber mill or a sawmill. And right now, for instance, it says that you can't operate your machinery, your sawing, no machineries for sawing, planing, chipping, or other wood processing shall operate between 7 p.m. and 7 a.m. Well, the mill, since it opened, they have started operating around 6:30 in the morning. And in fact, they turn their equipment on right around 6 o'clock in the morning so it can warm up, so that when their employees arrive and start ready to work at 6:30, it's warmed up and ready. So they've never complied with this. It hasn't been applicable to them, but we thought it was appropriate to go ahead and ask for a modification to that requirement so that they can operate during those hours. It's particularly important during the summer months with the heat and our employees are working outside in the intense heat. They can start at that hour in particular, and they usually finish up earlier than 7 p.m. So we're proposing to adjust that. Instead of it being, the limit being from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., having have it be from 7 p.m. to 6 a.m. And then there's another hour of operation regulation that applies to the loading and unloading of wood and wood products. And that restriction is in place from midnight to 7 a.m. And we're proposing to just shift that an hour earlier and say no loading or unloading of wood products between 11 p.m. and 6 a.m. for the same reason. Some of the lumber starts being delivered at 6 o'clock in the morning, or they start loading and unloading wood at 6 a.m. So we want to make sure that we're complying. We're asking to modify that window of time on the restriction so that it matches up with their historic hours of operation. We did add one caveat to the very end, except for as part of the wood drying process at the kilns, because technically at some point they might upgrade their kilns such that there would technically be lumber running through their kilns in the nighttime. It wouldn't be noisy, but it would technically constitute loading or unloading lumber, and so we wanted to be clear that that might happen. That is all of, I know that's a long list, but that's what we have, and again, we'd be happy to answer any questions. I know it's a lot.
I'm Dennis Holberg. I live in Hillsborough Lane. We are right across 250 from the sawmill office. Okay. And there was, I hope I don't get angry about this, but I'll try my best. Put yourself in the place of living right across the street from the sawmill, okay, and you have a family. And our house, the main part of the house that we live in was built in the late 1700s. So some of those houses on Hillsborough Lane were there before the sawmill, okay? We take care of a 2-year-old grandson, okay? And I'm glad that they finally got the deal settled with the noise, because that went on forever, okay? And it was, you know, you could tell when the hum was turned off and then complaints were made and then it was turned back on. You could tell that. And the county did some studies on that from a house across the street from us in Yancey Mills. They set out like a tripod thing to go because there was another complaint lodged against that.
I think that was our equipment we did.
Whoever owned that. But anyway, Ms. Kilroy, who's the person at the county who you can call, and she's a county executive. We called her one time because of noise. Okay, so I'm glad that they finally got that settled. There is also other issues. It's not just the noise. It's the dust. And we recently got part of our roof repainted, okay? And they came and they scraped it all off, and they put a primer on and the first coat of paint. In 2 days, those painters came back and had to wipe down that roof with rags that turned black. So that's the kind of pollution. Now, I can't prove this coming from the sawmill, but that's probably a pretty good guess that that's where the dust comes. So it's not just the noise, it's the dust. People move to Albemarle County because it's a rural county. It's a beautiful area, and there's we have 3 schools very close. One of the noise complaints even came from as far away as Old Tree. Okay, that bothers me. And I think that the other issue besides that is basically not just noise from the kiln. There was also areas, I don't know whether that's when they changed it around, there were times where you would come in, drive into the house, and there's a total smoke thing going on. And so I went over there and talked to the sawmill one time about this, because I was concerned about our family, our kids, our grandson, and all this stuff. And I talked to them for a long time, and they said, well, we'll deal with that. But there were also deals where we had that happen one time, and we don't know where it came from, but pretty much it probably came from the sawmill. And because that's the only place that could have come in there. And my wife called the office, and they said, we weren't even aware there was any smoke around here. Well, what is that? I don't know. But what my concern would be there with that smoke coming down is it not only affects the people that live across the street, it affects the employees, okay? And what I'm hearing coming at us is a lot of, there is a lot of building going on. And I can see where the sawmill needs to get better equipment to be able to sort things or not. But it really bothers me when all these areas that need to be, because of whether they're, I guess the county put up with it, because it sounds like a lot of it is non-compliance. And to me, I see a pattern with this sawmill of non-compliance, of not being real aware of what kind of stuff they're putting in there, not enough research going on, that can affect people that live across the street who were living there before the sawmill was built. Okay? Now, they employ a lot of people out there, almost between 60 and 80 employees out there. And I'm concerned about that too. But with all this non-compliance and reducing things from like 300 feet to 65 feet, that was put in for a certain reason. Okay, to protect rural areas, to protect houses and protect the village of Yancey Mills. And it just looks like there's, I don't know what the new green pieces of equipment is across the street. I thought that was a sorting machine itself. It's to the left of the office. What is that?
That's the sorter stacker.
That's the sorter stacker. Was that, did the sawmill have to get a permit to put that in there?
It's equipment. The equipment does not require a building permit, but the building that will eventually go around it requires a building permit. So we've been working with the building official. That's why we stopped construction.
It's the green thing, and that's the start of it. Because it looks like,
the equipment itself.
when you show the map up there with the red part, it looks like it's farther around the bend from that green piece of equipment. He was showing a red area that kind of goes around the bend. Is that part of that green thing out there now to the left of the office? Is that part of that? The piece of equipment is green.
Yep.
And I assume there was a new sorter to replace the old sorter that's very antique looking.
Correct.
Okay.
That is literally an outline around an aerial photograph of the existing structure that's partially constructed.
Okay, so it's going to go farther out from what it is now.
Correct,
Yeah.
and it will eventually be enclosed with a building. So
Okay.
you won't see the green.
Yeah,
But
because I just, I'm a retired nurse and I'm very concerned about health. I retired from Martha Jefferson, and I'm just very concerned about this non-compliance stuff and narrowing all these areas that were put in place for a reason. And maybe those are obsolete or something, but it just looks like, to me, and I don't know how much noise that sorter puts out. I don't know if there's been any studies done, but I've been here 37 years, so I'm not from Virginia. I moved out here after meeting my future wife. And I just, over time, what you're seeing is you got trucks that are loading there between, I don't know, 4:30 in the morning. Okay, type of thing where they're loading stuff, loading trucks, loading sawdust and all this stuff. And there seems like there's, over time, and maybe that's what happens on a sawmill, they become much more active, that this stuff is going on earlier, and it's just there's a constant increase in activity with an increase in dust, which is no telling what's in there. Maybe it's a lot of just wood stuff. I don't know. But it concerns me a lot, and I think that this gathering here need to take that into consideration, that yeah, it is a heavy industry thing. It does employ a lot of people, but you cannot forget about schools, new development, and I'm sorry that the new development is happening kind of close to this sawmill, but there's no way to stop it. But I think we got to be real careful and real intense about safeguarding the people that live close to this sawmill. I think, and I'm just concerned about that. And thank you.
I live right across from him, and Bill actually placed the equipment on our front door. So I'm not making this up. I'll just stick with the facts. You yourself said it took you 9 months to cure this. You're asking for 65 decibels, no, 74 decibels during daytime. That is above the level of a vacuum cleaner, as OSHA says. Constant hum of a vacuum cleaner. That's what that noise level is. And 60 decibels is actually that noise level. So you are basically saying it's okay to expose residents in that area to the constant hum of a vacuum cleaner that will arise out of the Yancey mill operations. I kind of find that very surprising, because a lot of the setbacks that are put in place, they were put in place after OSHA actually came to realize that, hey, this noise is really not good for anyone. These are not, I mean, yeah, from point of view of business, it might just look like, hey, this is being thrown out in the air. But there were scientific studies done that actually prove that if you expose a person for more than 8 hours a day to that noise level, it actually causes hearing loss. So I have 2 young kids. I'm certainly, one is 2.5 years old, another is 6 years old. I'm certainly concerned about them. I'm also concerned that I walked into my son's room at 2 o'clock in the morning, and there are lights from the tractor trailers loading up, shooting straight into his room. This is not made up. This has happened several times. And you wonder, okay, the boy sleeps through it sometimes he doesn't, but again, it's one of those things which is very real. And so, to say that it's okay to remove the setbacks, I think you're doing your community a huge disservice by not actually studying why those setbacks were put in place. Because to me, 600 feet or 100 feet distance sounds very logical. There's a reason for that, because that noise level that you're saying, 75 decibel, OSHA says that that's the hum of a vacuum cleaner. It's written. You can go to the OSHA website and check that.
I'm not disputing that, and I will, any technical
So
questions on the
my whole thing is, fine, if that is what you're saying, that should we all just start thinking about packing up and leaving? Because I am really not interested in having my sons have hearing damage from the mill.
One thing I should just clarify is this is the same level noise that's been going on. We're not proposing, other than the sorter stacker, which Bill, our consultant, has estimated what additional noise, if any, will come from the sorter stacker. It will be enclosed in a building, which will help. It's to reflect the existing noise that's been going on for decades.
No, and here's the thing, from your point of view, or from a lot of other points of view, if you're not looking at it on a daily basis, it might not sound like much.
I understand.
If it's, hey, it's 5 decibels here and there, it doesn't make a difference, you pass it once, no big deal. A person who lives there and experiences it every day, it's a totally different experience.
I understand.
It is a totally different experience to have your son come back home from school and say, what's that noise, Dad? And I'm not making that up.
I understand.
So that's where I'm coming from. It's like, you can say, 100 feet is too much and we don't want that, but what's the solution on our side? Where do we go? We can't move 100 feet away from the mills.
Again, they're not proposing to make more noise than has been there. It's a reflection of the fact that that equipment has been located there for so long and it's never been in compliance. And that it's, again, challenging to even isolate the ambient noise, because when that equipment is being used in the daytime during business operations is the same time that vehicles are driving by on Route 250 and on the interstate the whole time.
That equipment was on my front door for 14 days. So I don't know how much error you're factoring in, but during all those 14 days, I'm absolutely sure that it wasn't always a truck that sent it above the...
Well, that's different noise, just to clarify.
No, that's what I'm saying, that every time it went beyond the acceptable level, it wasn't a truck that said it there. I'm pretty sure about that.
I'm not implying that it was. We know that that noise was attributable to the boiler fan. No question. It took us a while to figure out that it was and to find a solution for sure. And they've ramped their business way back to minimize as much as possible any disruption. We heard from a lot of people. We know just how disruptive that it was to all of you, and particularly you all right across the street. And they worked very hard and spent a tremendous amount of money to make sure they found a solution that was effective. It took 4 tries to find the right solution, but they were determined to do so.
I appreciate that. I absolutely appreciate that, and that's part of the reason why I'm here. I like living here. I'm not from Virginia. We moved here in 2006. 6, my wife finished her residency and we decided to stay here. So I appreciate that the effort was put into it, but at the same time, it is a huge decision for us to buy a house and stay somewhere and decide to stay somewhere. And so I feel like that whole decision is at risk because of what's being proposed.
I want to make sure that everyone gets to say something.
Really quick, I wanted to clarify, it sounds like you're saying that you're having trouble getting an accurate read on what the level's gonna be with the new sorter stacker and even inside of a building. Is that?
Let me ask, Bill, would you mind answering this question? Because I don't have the technology expertise. And Bill, why don't you come up here so people can see you and you'll be doing
To be clear, what I want to get at is your response is, well, this is kind of the noise that it always has been, but with this new piece of equipment, and then I haven't heard a straight answer about how loud that neighbors may expect for that to be. Is that the expectation that it would stay the same, or is it going to be louder and that's why you want to give yourself a little bit of room to?
Yeah, sure. So the mill has right now a sorter stacker in the back of it's sort of back here. This facility here is very similar. It's a little wider here because there's some other stuff happening. But this facility here is essentially the same as this. So this says new sorter. This is where the sorter is. This says new stacker. The stacker comes back this direction. So what I did was I measured sound from this existing sorter stacker. It's already enclosed in the building, right? So we can predict, the technology of the sorter stacker hasn't changed. They just need more capacity. So the technology hasn't changed. It's going to produce the same amount of sound. It's pretty straightforward. If you saw this thing, you'd understand. So I measured the sound from this and then essentially placed it as a source where this is. And then we can add the sound level contribution from that to the rest of the noise that is being made by the mill. And the sound level difference is pretty small. At this location here, the closest property boundary, I want to say, my notes are over there, but I want to say it's 2 dB higher. Right? 2 dB is what we would consider not noticeable. 3 dB is like just perceptibly noticeable. So at that location, it's not going to be much. Over here, it's still, the sound level over here is already a little lower, so it's still about 2 dB louder. But it's still in that range where it's not going to be noticeable. And so out here, where we're further away, it doesn't contribute to the sound level at all. So, I mean, out here, the sound level from the road is significantly louder. To give you an idea, just ambient traffic, right, without the facility operating, is on the order of, well, it varies, but the average measurement, if we just take one average, 5-minute average, how the county defines it, 74 dBA, right? That's loud. And the sorter stacker, which is right here, the debarking machine is right here, that had little to no impact on the total sound level because it was roughly equivalent in sound level. So the interesting thing about all of this is there's already so much ambient noise that it's really difficult to just say what is the exact sound level of the mill at all of these locations, because the county ordinance only spells out a certain amount of reduction that you can apply in removing the contributions from ambient. So sort of bringing this back to your question, the sound level at most of the property boundary isn't going to change with the new sorter stacker. It's just going to be at this closest portion, I'll point it out again, just right through here, where it's going to be a little louder. And
how much is about 2 dB louder?
Yeah, I believe it's 2. I mean, I've got the numbers. If anyone wants actual numbers, I can pull that out. But it's around that level. Did that answer your question, Jenny?
Yes. I mean, except for, it sounded like you were asking to go up more, like a lot, but I don't know, I didn't catch all that.
So let me go back to that.
Because I think to the neighbors, that sounds like
a lot louder.
yeah, like
A lot
that.
louder, yes.
gives you, I mean, I understand where you might be coming from, but where they might be coming from is so, I mean, then if all these things are happening at once, or I'm just trying to think of it from their perspective, what that means. That if it isn't, if you're saying that it really won't be that noticeable, but you're giving yourself this room with that would be a noticeable difference to them.
Let me let Bill answer that, because I also would ask Bill if you can explain the way the county ordinance requires you to measure on this average and how that can vary depending on uncontrollable ambient noise and how, use the example when you measure that night on the property line.
Wait for Jenny to she ask the question.
Okay.
So she brought up variability. So if I stand, let me back up for a moment. The county defines the ordinance as 60 dBA over a course of 5 minutes, and that they want you to measure what's called a continuous equivalent level. Essentially, it's an average. And if I take a 5-minute measurement with my sound level meter, and then immediately take another one, the number's going to be different, right? And that's because there were 100 cars that went by or 120 cars that went by in a 5-minute period, whatever it is. So it's the same with the mill's activity, right? If I make a 5-minute average and they drop 10 trees into the debarking equipment or 12 trees, right? The number changes. And we don't plan our measurements. I don't ask them the question, when are you going to have the fewest number of trees so we can get the lowest number? When are you going to have the most trees so we can get the highest number? We just take a sample, right? So you can imagine if I took more than 5 minutes around the property line, it would take forever to make those measurements. So what we have is, we have a measurement which we would call characteristic. And at that point, you sort of hope that it's not going to vary too much, and you give yourself a little bit of a buffer, plus or minus 2-3 dB. And if operations significantly change, not that they have the capacity for them to change, but if they did, then we want to remeasure, redo the pre-performance survey. So I think that I don't think anyone would want to say.
Well, why are you unable to soundproof this piece of, I'm sure the piece of equipment is enormous, but I also know that, for example, sound barriers are put up next to highways. Why can you not mitigate this problem?
And so it depends on which piece of equipment you're talking about. The sorter stacker?
Whatever is disturbing people.
Well, last year it was the boiler fan. So we've all driven by the mill, right? If you look towards the back of the facility, there's this big tube sticking up out of the building. That's the exhaust stack for the boiler. And the boiler fan blows right out of that. And you can imagine that thing's 50 feet tall. There's no putting up a barrier next to that. And then it all just exits the stack really fast, right? And then sort of expands as it goes out. So you can't put a barrier next to that, so the solution was more difficult, right? And that problem, I would say, has been solved. Like, I don't think anyone's complaining about that noise anymore. I mean, I would say I would invite you out to give a listen, but that's really up to the mill to decide. But the hum is for all intents and purposes gone. The other thing, the sorter stacker, that's going to be in a building. If they find that that's problematic, they can insulate the building. They have a barrier. The barrier is the building, right? So it's happening inside. So you close your doors, if there are doors. If there aren't, you add doors. And then you deaden the panels, because it's just a metal building, and you add insulation to absorb sound. The other equipment, like the debarking equipment, that could potentially get a barrier wall, because it is right up against the road there. That hasn't been discussed. We haven't talked to that.
Is that piece of equipment to the right of the office?
Yeah, it's.
That older.
Yeah. I'm going to step over here. Okay. So here's the mill building here. There's the office. Okay, so this thing sticking out here.
Right. Okay.
Sort of shaped like that. That's the I call it the debarker, but I guess that's the what did you call it?
The stem loader.
The stem loader. Okay. So over here are all the trees. Okay. And they have these log loading machines, essentially it's like a claw, right? Picks up the log, carries it over, and drops it into a little hopper, and then it, I think, falls down into this, and then it gets pulled into the mill. And I may have some of that wrong, but that's essentially how that works. And so the noise we hear here at this stem loader is the actual log dropping down into this little carrier. And so at that position, to answer your question, yeah, they could put a barrier wall up because you're right at the source. It's not a very tall source. And that is the closest source of noise to these homes up here. But that only happens during the day, and I don't know that that's noise that people have complained about. Historically, in the last year, it's just been about this. It's right here. That's the boiler. And the stack comes right out at the top. So I'm not privy to all those complaints though, so I don't know if they've gotten complaints about the stem loader or not.
And is there any role for the county to play in this? It would seem to me that since the county has not held this particular company to any sort of limits over time, and people, it seems to me that it's incompatible to have an industrial facility like this so close to a few residential properties. Is there any precedent for the county buying folks out, or the county giving a tax break to the company so that they could buy residents out?
I have no information to answer your question.
Okay,
I can
well,
certainly investigate.
I think this is one where probably we have to think outside the box. And it will increasingly be a problem as this area grows, that you have incompatible uses side by side.
So Bill maybe can answer that better, and then we have another question that, so Bill.
Just to let you know what the county's role is. So they've applied for a special exception. We've received some of this information, but not all the information that has been presented here tonight. We'll get all that information, we'll analyze it, we'll make a recommendation. Don't know what the process will be yet. It may go to the planning commission and then the board, or it may go just to the board. There's a process to follow there. But we'll go through that and make a recommendation, and we'll be looking at some of the comments you made, some of the things that you're looking at, and other things. While I'm up, if any of you, so that we'll try to do some kind of mailing. Special exceptions are a very odd thing within the ordinance. There's no notification provision in the ordinance, so we try to identify how to notify people. So if you send me an email, I will create an email distribution list and add you to it. I'll let you know when things have been submitted, how you can see it, when the reports are done, when public hearings will be. And my email address is bfritz, F-R-I-T-Z, @albemarle.org. So my name's Bill Fritz, so it's just bfritz @albemarle.org. If you send me an email, I'll add you to a distribution list. I'll let you know when anything's submitted. If you send me something, I'll make sure it gets forwarded to whoever's holding a public hearing. And if you have questions, you can always call me. Thanks.
There's a bunch of hands.
Yeah, I don't want to speak for all the residents, but, obviously Lisa, my wife and I, we own the property, which is that big green section where the new piece of equipment's going that heads out onto Route 250. I think any increase in noise, in my eyes, would be totally objectionable, and I'm sure there are other residents would object to it too. And bigger concern, which I echo the gentleman sitting in front of me's earlier comments, is a lot of these laws and regulations aren't new. So, I would question, why would something be built when it's not in compliance in advance of, getting, an exception or, a change to the rule. Several years ago, I went to another hearing when the mill was applying to get another exception for a higher crane to be able to lift logs on and off. And they went ahead and bought this piece of equipment that, again, didn't comply with regulations. So it gets back to, there's just a pattern of, until we get forced to having to comply, let's just push the envelope. I own several businesses and I have to comply by the law, and, I always consult my attorneys and engineers before I stick a shovel in the ground. That doesn't seem to be the case. it seems to be let's build it and see what happens. Which, you know, again, it's very disheartening to see how many exceptions you're asking for. You know, since, you know, obviously when you go back and you see the picture in 1950, that's one thing, but, you know, there's been an evolution of changes to the mill, which I would guess 90% of the new structures never complied, even, you know, during current regulations. You know, I'm not sure how old the piece of equipment that's being replaced that's going to be closer to my property, I don't know how old that is, but did that comply prior to it being moved because it's too small? Yeah, you know, again, if you're moving it closer to residents, which, again, I would question who was coming up with that master plan on placing it where it's being placed, which, to be perfectly honest, you're placing it closer to residential properties. Obviously mine, you know, obviously is the closest, but you're getting it closer to the roads and it's going to be closer to people on Hillsborough, it's going to be closer to people at Old Trail. So you're not moving it further away towards the highway, which wouldn't be so objectionable. You're moving it closer to the taxpayers and the people who live there. So again, any movement, any increase in noise, again, I'm just one person, but I think probably most of the residents would agree.
Right, Joe and Lillian, whatever.
Sure, yeah, so I live in Old Trail and I was one of the people affected by the hum. And I feel that the noise and vibration ordinances are there for a reason. I'd just like to echo what someone said before. They're not just arbitrary, they're there for a reason. And I feel like a lot of us felt really frantic and kind of powerless when that was all happening. And it was because of things like ordinances that helped make sure that the problem was resolved. And so I'm very, very worried about an increase in the threshold for noise and vibration to where then when the noises get higher, we're not going to have anything to protect us. And so that makes me feel especially anxious. I feel like the ordinances are the things that protect our health and safety.
All right, we'll go to Joe.
So that's, yeah.
We'll go Joe, then Roger.
Okay, two questions I have in mind, and Bill, maybe you can answer. When did the actual noise ordinance come into effect? That wasn't in 1980, was it?
I believe it was 1980.
1980 was the...
December 10th. I believe all the regulations that apply to this, except for the heavy industry setbacks, have been in existence since December 10th, 1980. And there were some changes to how we did setbacks for every zoning district 2 years ago, 3 years ago, something like that.
Okay, well, and then secondly, I want to make you all aware of something, and you came up with the term, what is the county's role in this? And Ann, I know you cut timber on your place several years back, and I have 6 or 8 acres of loblolly pine planted on my farm, which in a few years I think I'm going to have to harvest to make my semi-annual payments to the county to help build a $55 million school coming up. And, but as Virginia reforestation through the 90s and the 2000s, I planted hundreds of thousands of loblolly pine in Albemarle County. And we have landowners throughout the county who are going to be dependent for a market for that product. Myself, I'm just a reed, 6 or 8 acres is nothing to the amount of pine that's just here in this county. And I know other counties that we bring in lumber to the Yancey mill, and those landowners there, we farmers are dependent on our natural resources. You know, we to make our living and our annual payments to the county. And so just keep that in mind that the county-wide does have an interest in the Yancey sawmill from that angle. And personally, I think the adjustments that Yancey Mill is asking for are so minimal that it's not going to affect, it would have an effect on the operation if it go to business, then I don't have a market, but these requests they're asking for, I think, are very minimal, and I'd like to see them approved, of course, because I'm supporting.
Where do you live? Do you live nearby?
I do not, sir, and.
Well, I think that's why I would be in favor if I was you too.
Yes, and I can understand your point about,
Yeah.
but just want to say that there is a county interest
Absolutely.
in this, not only right on site, but maybe every time.
There's important places for landfills.
All right,
I don't want to get
we're gonna
sold.
go with Roger's next.
So, anyway, I just wanted to make you aware of that fact. And
Can I just ask a point of clarity? Are there other sawmills in the county?
no, sir.
There's one in South Garden.
Oh, yes, that's a hardwood mill. There are no other.
Yeah.
Yancey cuts pine, predominantly, all pine. There is a hardwood sawmill at North Garden. But this is the only one. In fact, there used to be a pulpwood market. By pulpwood, that's the wood on the tree that doesn't make saw timber. There was a wood yard in Ivy that we could take in. Like after this storm we had 2 weekends ago, I could have taken $1,500 or $2,000 of pulpwood to Ivy Wood Yard. That would have helped my bottom line tremendously. But now I would have to haul it to Zion Crossroads and through Anna Louisa, whichever it is, or to Piney River in Nelson County. That, you know, our markets are very limited here, so, yes.
All right,
To be clear, you're not looking at raising your decibels or your noise level. That's what you're saying, you're not gonna raise your.
For the most part, with the exception of the estimate of the additional noise that might come from the sorter stacker, which, correct me if I'm wrong, you said would be, as your estimate is 2 decibels higher.
So essentially, there's not gonna be a change in the noise.
Correct. It's intended to reflect the existing conditions, the existing levels of noise, the existing setbacks. Exactly.
great, Mr. Paul.
I just wanted to ask if there's been any offer to put any screening along 250? A nice planted trees along 250 would certainly help with the noise, and it would look better.
Thank you. Yes, we have actually been talking about that to help, and we couldn't officially make that proposal until we closed on the land acquisition with GDOT, but that is part of that discussion and analysis, is ways that some landscaping or trees can be installed to help screen that area, the parking as well as some of the timber.
Okay, go.
I just wanted to say that I'm very sympathetic with people who have grandchildren and find them in harm's way. I live on a street that's far too fast, but Joel D'Annunzio said, no, you've got to leave the speed limit. So I've come to accept the fact that I have to be careful about these things. When I look at it as a little different perspective, the question is, what would be the alternative to enhancing and rebuilding a sawmill here? And my fear is that there might be a drive to put in a Walmart or a Cracker Barrel instead, if they cannot get these special exceptions, which I think are relatively modest.
Is it zoned for that?
No.
Scare me.
It
My point
has
is
been proposed to be
that
zoned in the past, though. It's
this
not-
sawmill really does provide a bit of an identity for Crozet. When we first moved down here, my wife said, others may disagree with her, but she likes the smell. She likes fresh cut pine, and as she drives by, she knows she's home. So I think it's an asset that has value to Crozet generally, despite the fact that it might also provide some challenges, such as noise, sawdust, and appearance. So
I'm also curious, just to follow up on that, would any of these special exceptions be conveyed in any kind of rezoning or sale? like the setbacks.
The setback.
If the setbacks are reduced, would those be conveyed if the lumber yard was sold or it was rezoned?
No, with the special exception, the board can put on whatever reasonable conditions are.
So it would only apply so long as Yancey Lumber Company.
Or to existing buildings, or to existing uses, or structures, or, yeah, you can do those kinds of things. It's not a variance that, it's a little different than a variance.
It should be tied to the use, not the sale. You can't.
Right, I just
But
think it's
yeah, I think if you
worth
wanted
noting
to do
that,
that,
you know, that if it does become a Cracker Barrel, suddenly the Cracker Barrel doesn't have, it has zero setbacks, you know?
And for what it's worth, you know, this all started with the sorter stacker. It is a multi-million-dollar investment in the business at this location.
Right, which I find
They're-
assuring.
Yeah, they're trying to invest in the future of the business at this location for the long-term success of it.
Right.
My alarm is totally based on the figures that you put forward. You said you were asking for the decibel level to go from 60 to 75. So when you say that it'll only go 2 dB up, I understand that's what you're estimating, but you're giving yourself a room of error 7 times what you're claiming.
Let me clarify, just, it's to reflect the existing conditions. It already exceeds during the daytime because of the challenges with all the ambient noise and all the other noise going on. It doesn't meet it now, it never has, and it hasn't legally been subject to those noise regulations because the mill came first. Nevertheless, the best Bill can estimate it'll be about 2 decibels louder at certain locations once the sorter stacker is installed and operational. But otherwise, the request is to reflect the existing noise levels, not to allow for more noise along that area. So, just to clarify.
Okay, so don't have very much time left because we need to say a little bit for this, but we've got Tom wanting to say something. Go ahead.
Just a quick question, yeah. Just clarification, the offsets that are being moved or being proposed, would that then allow new buildings to go closer to the boundaries?
I can answer that. It can be conditioned on
Yeah.
the existing or proposed buildings only,
Yeah.
so it only applies to those. And that is typically how special exceptions are done.
But the sorter stacker is new equipment now. isn't it?
It could be existing or
They already
proposed.
started building that
Right.
over top of the easement.
I guess he's
Without
saying
permission.
that they could apply it just to that,
Right,
just to that particular piece
to
of
the
equipment
existing building and the proposed sorter stacker.
in the future.
That could be done.
So we could request that of Jenny and Ann. I guess.
Just one clarification in response to the earlier question about what's the county's role. I was thinking about your question being because of what's happened in the previous 50 years as opposed to what's going forward. So that was why I answered that's the resources needed. But Bill took care of the process forward question, so thank you.
I have a question. So your role in this was measurement only.
Yeah.
Because to follow up on what Paul said, it seems to me the win-win here is the mitigation. You know what I mean? Is that I agree with Doug about lumber yard and its importance and its role in the community and that. But again, if something can be done to mitigate rather than regulate them, and for the former rather than the latter.
Okay, last comment.
So the one map with the red outline of the sorter stacker, is that just the piece of equipment? Is there an outline for the building that's going to go around it? How much bigger that would be? Because the way the sorter stacker is right now, it's almost on our property, like it's right at the line. So like if there's a building that's going to go around it?
It wouldn't go any closer than, I don't know how to explain it.
The red line.
The red line around the piece of
The red
equipment.
line surrounding it reflects the outer boundaries of the building.
That's the outer boundary of the cement wall that's built there. The building will be on the inside of that. So
Okay,
you
that
have
was my
the road-
question.
You have the road coming down, you have a wall, then the building will be attached to the sorter stacker.
Okay, that was my question.
And how high would the buildings be?
I want to say 23 feet, but I'm not sure right now. I think it's 23.
I think if people have more questions and comments, you can address Bill or Valerie, and I'm sure we can.
I definitely think for people who are interested in following the process, Bill offered his email and explained that there's much more detail that will go into this, that will come through staff. So my suggestion would be, if you're interested in following the process and making sure you're up to date with, as things move forward, that Bill is your guy, and staff are really good about compiling a list of people who are interested in getting out communication, so that you don't.
Send me an email. Send me an email, I'll add you to the list. Anytime anything's submitted or we schedule something, I'll communicate those things.
And that's at albemarle.com?
efritz@albemarle.org.
All right, thank you guys for coming. We'll get director talk about the master plan update.
Don't leave, the master plan is
There, we should have locked the door.
That's how much the plan matters. Until their issue comes up, and then they'll want the plan to defend it. Right.
So hopefully like next week. I'm just waiting on her tape.
All right, just to clarify, the meeting's not over, so if
The meeting's not over.
Yeah, so the appraiser already went out there already.
Thank you.
So they got the back, so now we're just waiting on the CCAC to go through it. So if we're lucky this week, we'll probably
They did so for those of you that are sticking around, thank you for taking this. So again, this is our kind of final recap for this phase 1 of the Crozet master plan update process. I think tonight I just want to briefly touch on what happened with our last workshop, which was it last week already? Time's flying by. It's already November 13th, and that's freaking me out. So I just want to briefly touch on just again what we did at our third workshop, and just also make sure you're all aware of this tool we have, which is where we're kind of able to roll out. So again, our third workshop focused on recapping the first 2 workshops and bringing forward a draft set of guiding principles and a set of kind of goals we might follow as we start to flesh out the master plan in the coming months for phase 2. So just for all the same questions we asked at the workshop and the survey are all available on this form. You can actually see how people respond, their comments as well. So this is really our preferred way. If you have thoughts on some of the goals, guiding principles we've identified, please leave your comments in there. I think we've already had over 210 participants respond, so we really getting a lot of good feedback so far. And again, all the boards as well from that last workshop are also posted online. So that includes the for each chapter, again, what's in the 2010 master plan, some existing conditions, information, so again, some photos, some mapping exercises. So that, for example, this is from the, I believe, the second workshop, that PIN activity we had you all do. A feedback, summary of the feedback we heard from the 2017 community survey, what we heard in workshop 1 and 2 is summary there, and then for each chapter, again, we're looking to really do this to provide clarity in the master plan. We've heard that's a concern that has come up repeatedly about how do we build this master plan with its goals, recommendations, and the maps, how do they all follow each other. So we're starting again, this first phase has been about refining these guiding principles, making sure that we start off identifying what our interests, what our priorities are, and then from there we're going to structure the meetings and the next phase around each one of these chapters. We'll have activities designed to help flesh out these goals and turn them more from a short phrase into, again, a goal, and identify how we'll actually make this happen. So I'd encourage you, spread the word, share this information. I know that I believe the CCA shared out some of this survey earlier today. So I encourage you guys to fill it out, take a look at some of the comments in there. I think you can also see how people are responding to questions as well. This really help us identify what we need to tackle in the next phase.
What's the URL?
It is publicinput.com/imagine Crozet. And it's also accessible through the county website. Okay. If you search Crozet Master Plan Update, we have a link posted on there as well.
All right.
So check that out, cool resource for us, and all the content is posted up there as well. Another quick update is that next Tuesday, the 19th, we're going to be bringing some of this information to the Planning Commission just as an update, check in with them about what has happened so far with the Phase 1 process. Again, bringing forward just some of the rough feedback we heard from that first workshop, and starting to outline our work plan to get this done in the coming months. So the staff report's posted online on the Planning Commission website. Just again recaps where we've been so far, some of the topics we've addressed. It's really more just to catch the Planning Commission up on what's happened so far in the process, what comes next, and make sure they're on board with what's coming. We do also have we're working to draft our engagement plan for this spring. I'm going to see if I can get this to full screen. Can't figure out how to make that work. But again, we're starting to scope out what the dates will be. We will have, again, continue to have more workshops. We'll have 2 focused on the character and land use. January will focus on our edges, boundary area for the development area, and the centers. February we'll talk more about land use, the actual colors on the map. And March will move into connectivity, transportation, traffic issues. April will be about conservation, parks, and green systems. And then we'll wrap up in May with a summary, bring all that together, everything we heard of project prioritization exercise, and then from there we'll move back into, we'll start to draft out the rest of the plan, that the last sticking points with the CAC. We'll move to work sessions with the board and planning commission late summer, early fall, and hopefully have the plan ready to go for adoption by the end of 2020. So we're still working to identify, again, we have these workshops, where else do we need to do focus groups or other sorts of engagements. We're starting to meet tomorrow with our communications and public engagement office to start to flesh some of the details out and figure out as a staff how we build up our master plan.
I request a map. You send out all your maps, and I love your maps, but I tried to draw on there what land is actually left that can be brought up for rezoning. I came up with like 220 acres, which isn't a lot. You got to exclude single-family lots in neighborhoods that are already there, because nobody's ever going to accumulate enough of those to make it worthwhile. So, I mean, I'm kind of like, can we have something that shows what's actually realistically developable? Is that a word?
Yeah, I'd like to see it too.
Yeah,
because that kind of matters. You can change the colors on some existing neighborhoods, and that doesn't mean jack, because nothing's going to happen.
Yeah, I think that's a fair request. We did try to do a similar map to that, I think, in April. We brought out, we had a conversation with our chapter leads on land use. We were at the field school for that meeting. We brought out some maps that showed the properties. We should have a land use map overlaid, where there is development proposed, where it's currently built out, and where there are critical resources. We kind of took a first step in identifying the question on what's left. And I think that as we look forward to...
Because not only is that important to know what's actually still up for grabs, if you will, but it can tell you where you need to focus your infrastructure.
Right, but within the growth areas, your capacity analysis that you had for us last night, you are looking at, previously you would exclude a single family home on a 1 acre. You were taking out 1 acre lots, and now they are adding those in because they are potential for redevelopment when you look at what's picked through. So isn't that the methodology, was that previously that had been excluded, but to look at capacity, and when you go highs and lows, you were adding those back in?
We adjusted these scenarios, so what we did 2 years ago was it was an over 2 acre parcel that had at least an acre we could draw an acre on the site. We would count a potential acre in there. For the sake of making the model more consistent across that, we did make a tweak to the filter, which still includes you still have to be able to add a couple parcels or a couple additional dwellings on there based on the zoning of the complex. So it does eliminate most of the same parcels. It's pretty consistent.
Right, but the language in the capacity analysis was the likelihood of someone buying that, tearing the existing home down and rezoning to build.
Not rezoning to build, but again, I'm happy to talk more about the capacity analysis we did for the group's information. We did recently finish a kind of first attempt at the residential capacity analysis. We do every 2 years that kind of looks at the build out of the county's development areas based on what land is left under comp plan and current zoning. We use this to help inform some of these decisions. We're planning to bring that to the CCAC next month. Just a better overview of what that is and the methodology involved. But again,
For his question for the map though, you can.
Yeah, we have some, with the capacity analysis, we did kind of map that out this year, so we do have that information sort of available about, but again, it's not necessarily the same thing as what would come forward with potentially there.
If you could, appreciate if you could include in that capacity planning, affordable housing, how many units are proper, yet to be built, but have been proper with rezonings. I think we'd like to know that, since housing is an issue right now up before the county.
Yeah, that was not an issue we covered with the growth management report that we put together. I know that the county's principal plan for housing is looking at assessing that, but I know it's more difficult to get the actual count of what has been created as affordable housing just due to some of the sale requirements as well. So I know we're trying to get a handle on that data, but I don't know if it'll be with the capacity.
But what David wants is something I think that, I mean, Elaine had that at one point, and, I mean, we know what's spoken for, and like old trails happening, things, and when we all stood around the table here and looked at that map, it was pretty clear, that's what you're after. It's just some more.
I think we can create essentially the same map, but we can bring that up.
out the shore.
Yeah, I mean, things that, what's left.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We basically did the same map, so we can bring that back out in the future. That's the conflict of interest.
Yeah, I hope encouraging everybody, since we are at the stage where we're giving feedback on the guiding principles, which are already written, but I think it's important that we give some feedback, especially given the challenges that this group has consistently seen. And I think really most of the things that we've seen really boil down for the most part to two of the principles that where we can actually have some input. I think that's probably the character one. I don't know if you have there, Andrew, about supporting Crozet small town feel, because that's about development. And the other one is implementation. That's about priorities, funding. So the conversation earlier about schools and that kind of stuff. So I hope everybody around the table, if they haven't already done so, will comment on those. And in particular, maybe comment on that implementation and suggesting if there's language in the schools or something or a priority there. With respect to the character, the language is there. Currently it says, supporting Crozet small town feel with development that is compatible with scale design, offers housing choice, and respects its history. One thing that as I read that, thought that this group may want input on is its history, respects Crozet's history and natural setting. Because it seems like a lot of the issues about Sandy's issue about tearing down trees, and the conversation that we have about slopes and gross versus net and buildable areas, stream buffers. A lot of the development issues that we seem to have do involve our natural setting here in Crozet, which does set us apart from other potential areas. So to the extent that we have input on things that consistently come up before this group, I was just trying to find opportunities to think, what have we talked about in the past? What have been the sticking points? And are there suggestions that we can make in these guiding principles that in a year or two or three from now, when Smash One's in place, we can point to that guiding principle and have a good excuse for saying, view 2.0 doesn't go here because the guiding principle here, and we were sort of thoughtful in thinking ahead.
No, I think you're exactly right. My hope is that the guiding principles would eliminate any ambiguity that we had, as we had the problem with the last one, between what was on the map and, what was in the verbiage, so that the guiding principles would address those problems. We saw an issue tonight came up, as a matter of fact, with the lumberyard, and that how do we treat the I-64 interchange? Because on the last master plan, the board asked the community, did they or did they not want that, to be an expansion of the growth area? I think it's another question that we have to ask this time around. And, what we saw tonight, for me, more or less points to, no, we don't, because of the problem that we've just seen around that area. So, but I agree with you. I think the principles, they have to address the issues that we have.
Yeah, and so to just add on again, these principles are not final. These are intended to be revised based on your feedback. We'll probably be bringing them out again with each one of these meetings we have throughout the spring. And we'll ask, right now we're at 39% say accurately reflects, 30% say very accurately, but now between those two groups at 69%, how do we get that to 100 and make the refinements throughout all this? So If there's any thoughts you have, I mean, we're gonna, aggregate this data, see what's missing, and, make the tweaks where we can, and see if we can get that closer to being something that reflects our vision, so.
I have a thought. So I understand that I think it's the goal of the county to have some consistency amongst all the master plans, which I think is a really great way to approach it. But with that said, each one's going to be different, and I think we really need to make sure we're engaging the community. I mean, my hope is in this next piece, we have a pretty well engaged community. We have a unique situation because we're out here in this bubble, whereas other growth areas rub up against each other. We have attendance, sometimes it leaves when there are issues over, but I hope that we can capture, because we already have a plan, we're reviewing it and making changes to it, so we're not starting from scratch, so we have that going for us, and we have a very engaged community as long as we continue to engage them. And so I want, we need to make our stamp on this as a community, keeping it that we want some of that same language that's going to be found in all the master plans. So there's a common thread, but each needs to be unique to that area. So I wonder if, given this, sort of break because of the holidays, because no one's going to come to these meetings, if there's a way that you could get some information out that people might have a chance to look at, or just become re-inspired to come back when we start into the phase 2.
I mean, I think the break is actually going to help as far as engagement.
Right.
So.
I think it will too. I just wonder if there's something, if the group has an idea of something that could go out to the community that Andrew has, that people could look over and come back, because
I mean, maybe just this
some of the biggest feedback I've got is, should I come and get sitters and do all this to put stickers on things because I'm really busy, or am I going to come and get to talk about stuff like downtown and 250 and infrastructure and they want to get into it, not into it with you, but into the meat of they want to start not wordsmithing things, but pulling out the real issues that we've struggled with, that we feel like those of us that have worked closely with the old plan, that's what needs the revision.
Yeah. One step would be, the next meeting would be to identify those infrastructure projects that are outstanding, and give some kind of estimates and timelines about when they may be completed. I think, in reading through the comments, I think there were those people who said, well, stop growth, just don't do anything more. Obviously, you can discount those, but I think that the second loudest group was those on infrastructure and keeping up with the growth, which I would just mention that we were promised when we did the first master plan, but that's going back some.
Alarm bells went off when I heard the questions about the 1 acres and 2 acres and redoing, and so that needs to be very clearly presented, because what jumps off the page is a big conflict between the respecting of the community and character, and then the other side is demolishing a whole neighborhood and putting up high-rises. So that is a huge fear that this community has, is that big chunks of neighborhoods are very vulnerable. And so whether it's size and scale overlays and all sorts of things to talk about for compatibility, I know staff has loads of good ideas about that. So I encourage you to try to have some more information available. Because when I was looking on here, I mean, compatible with scale and design, offers housing choice. Those are really wonderful things, but then when I hear about the other side of it, it's scary. So I don't want to be surprised later to find out that the community has happily gone along looking at the words on the page and saying, oh, this is great, we're going to be taking care of, we're looking at our existing neighborhoods.
Well, I think, and I don't, to
And
be
then-
fair, I think it was a methodology.
It's a methodology
Yeah,
change,
that-
and
that-
the capacity analysis is a countywide analysis we do with a consistent methodology that says, here's what could happen if the entire area builds up.
And that won't happen.
Yeah, it won't
It's not
happen.
gonna happen. I
It is
think
completely
perhaps
theoretical.
the thing to do is, and I mean, because we're in the business, I can kind of tell you, there are certain things that just not work, doesn't economically work. Now, 50 years from now, we don't continue to provide the housing for the people that want to live and work in this community, it will become economically viable to buy a building and knock it down and do things. But we're not there yet. Huh?
It's happening all the time.
Well, no, I mean, there's a limit.
Yeah.
I mean,
It's
there
not
are
always-
people
yeah, I
that
get
show
that,
up
okay.
with too much money and can do that. There are people in my business that cannot do that because we will be out of business.
Okay.
But there are properties that are attractive.
There are,
That
I
sort
just
of
think
thing.
there's like a percentage. If you say, okay, all of these could become X. Well, the reality is maybe only 10% of that will actually happen.
Right. And that's
Is there
why
a
I
way
think
to
they did
quantify
low
that?
high.
Yeah, and I'm happy to talk about capacity analysis when we actually address that
Yeah.
topic next month.
Okay.
I got it, you're done.
One of the things that happened in the last go-round of the master plan was the community wanted a top-end population of X, and the county said they wanted a top-end population that was roughly twice that.
2X, yeah.
And now you're talking about a capacity analysis, and I think you better come in prepared to talk about, is the county going to up the capacity for Crozet yet again? Because I think a lot of people would be pissed off.
Well, I think 16 is the number. I haven't heard anybody say they want something higher than that, because that's where we were in 2010. But
Well, let's hear what
that's
his
something that
numbers are
we'll have
next
to
month.
find out.
Report's already online. So.
What?
The report's already online.
So do you have a number?
We're gonna punt until next month on this one. I'm not ready for this conversation tonight. We know that, there are a lot of ways you can slice it based on population, which multiplier you use. So I think, when we look at Crozet's actual capacity, now we have a conversation about, what is our build out? Again, what we did for the report we put out a couple of months ago and again last night is a countywide estimate based on but we'll look at Crozet, look at what's happening on the ground, and we'll make sure we consider that carefully.
And would that be the development area only?
The development area, so we already have the development area, that's what the analysis looks like.
It's really well done. You did a really good job, it'll be a good presentation, and you'll do specific to, you'll give a overall, but then you'll.
So to some degree, to truly understand the population impact, right, on the infrastructure, sure, it's the growth areas is a certain number, but then there's also the immediate ring around that, which sure isn't as dense, but it's a lot of people.
And they're all coming through.
And they're all
Right,
driving,
64,
they're the ones really driving, right? So 16 is one number, it may be closer to 20, 22.
Yeah, we have to start IPO.
Passing
Yes.
At least when you're talking about roads and schools and
Right, they
water
all
and
go to
sewer
schools
and
and everything.
yada, yada, yada.
I think the library needs some of those numbers because the catchment area needs to be about.
So all this to say is we're thinking about the population question, we know it comes up, it's a sensitive topic, and we're trying to find the best way to have a conversation tactfully and truthfully.
Even the public water is completely.
The 4 topics are great, and I think each description of each community will be different, but the 4 topics consistently is great. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. I don't think we have to do that.
Okay.